sort of close to your chin, but right here, and then the on button's on the side. Are you having people do audio?
Patient studies. ASEAN. We have been corresponding.
Are you having people do audience questions? Might need to be a little bit.
I'll know if you.
I'll take care of it. All right, test it for me.
Hello. Can you hear me? I'm loud, so just so you know.
That should be
Okay.
Should be a setup for a roving mic. And there's two ambassadors in it all.
Test it for me.
Testing 1, 2, 3.
Can I just like hold this, like just put it aside? Like, or should I have
Or
it in
you
my
can put it in your
my pocket? It'll. Okay. Get your mic on. Ooh, am I still? I haven't done it. Oh, so you're going to want it to go the other.
Test, 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 test. There's that.
There it goes. Maybe a little higher. So I'm going to do it on this side.
Test, test.
There we go.
There we go.
Test, test, test.
Okay, I'm going to push up just a little bit. How about there?
Sure. Sure, sure.
And do you control the mics from the back? Do you have like a board or
Yeah, I'm
something?
going to be up there.
Okay.
Now, would it if I speak, if I stand here, should I de-mic that?
I guess.
Okay, good morning, everyone. We'll get started. I'm Professor Apkar, and I'm delighted today to have two guests to talk about a podcast from mainland China. One is a longtime foreign correspondent for the New York Times who finished her almost 40-year career at the Times as the Beijing bureau chief, Jane Perlez, to my far left, to your right.
Woohoo! Thank you.
She wanted to kind of put a coda on her long experience in China.
No, a start.
Okay, there'll be more codas. And so she has Face Off as a podcast in its second season. Her editor, co-producer, conceptualizer, and also a podcast teacher, instructor at Wesleyan University and the Graduate School of Journalism at CUNY in New York, is Mia Lobel.
Hello.
And really did a really nice job helping conceive this and put this together. They'll tell you a little bit about where they started. Over to my right, on this side, your left, is Ryan Vasquez, who is the news director at WWNO and WRKF public radio stations in New Orleans and Baton Rouge, and also all things radio instruction and podcast instruction at a class here at Manship. So we have a really great panel. I don't want to get in the way of it. I'll just briefly say a couple of introductory remarks. We're going to talk about two things in two buckets today. One is the art of podcasting, storytelling, and narrative, which Mia is one of the kind of country's leading experts on after more than 20 years of doing audio work. And we're going to talk about China, which is one of the biggest stories of our generation, and often misunderstood or not even known at all by Americans. And so before we get started, I'm going to take 1 second and ask you to download, if you haven't done so already, download the podcast on your phones. I don't like people to whip out phones in class, but take your phones out and download Face Off so that you have it and know it. Just take a moment to do it.
No, really, do it. Wherever you get your podcasts. I have a QR code if anyone needs easier access.
It's in its second season. There are 8 episodes in the first and another 8 in this season, and they land every Tuesday, and I think there are 3 so far in the second season. Right. Okay, so if you're downloading that, I'll introduce you Jane briefly. She was a foreign correspondent for many years, first in East Africa, in Nairobi, later in Central Europe, which means Poland, Czech Republic, Bosnia, Southeast Asia, based in Jakarta, Indonesia, Pakistan, where she won a Pulitzer Prize with a group of reporters from the Times, and then finally China. In between, she covered the State Department and the Secretary of State in the George W. Bush
I just
years.
should add, State Department's like another foreign country, so I covered that in 98 to 2001.
Right.
When Madeleine Albright and then Colin Powell were
Right.
Secretaries of State.
Mia comes to us, is originally from upstate New York, got an undergraduate degree in anthropology, which is a form of journalism, I suppose. Then decided she would go to the Graduate School of Journalism at Berkeley, and then fell in love with audio. And she'll tell you briefly about that and audio storytelling. Ryan came to WRKF and WWNO as a news director a little more than a year ago. He came to us from several years, 9, I think, at the University of Florida in Gainesville, where he did basically all things multimedia and audio.
Yeah, don't boo me too much. I also came from Alabama as well, so I know I'm not the most popular person in the room.
We don't hold any of that against him. So I want to play, we're going to try to see this fancy remote technology. I want to play a soundbite that'll kind of kick off, that is from the podcast, but is kind of engaging about spying, particularly American military spy planes. It's from a couple decades ago, but it gives you a sense of the tension between the two countries militarily in, say, the early 2000s.
And this is the first episode of the first season that came out last year. First thing that anybody heard about. Maybe I hit it twice.
Let's hope.
Where do I point? Or is it not on? Is that why?
Might-
Oh, it's not on, that's why. Okay, now I'm good.
A plane is flying over the South China Sea when a Chinese fighter jet pulls up.
One's right there, 10 o'clock. You're gonna pass in front of us. Going right in front of us. Same altitude, all right.
It gets close,
Oh, we got bumped. Felt that one. We got bumped.
really close.
That's too close. I agree. Go and he's very, very close. Yeah. He's almost probably 20 feet from our wingtip. So he's inside of our wingtip.
This isn't new or even rare. Just one more move in a cat and mouse game that had been building for some time between the US and China in the disputed South China Sea.
K90, where is he? 90 has decreased slightly in altitude, still trailing 630, maintaining his distance. Oh, he got himself, this guy's having a little bit of problems. He's squirrely, not real steady. Oh yeah, he's having problems. Okay, he's moving out a little bit. He's falling back, 92 is falling back.
But this close call in January 2001 was a warning of more danger ahead. I'm Jane Perlez, longtime foreign correspondent and former Beijing bureau chief for the New York Times. This is Face Off. Over the next 8 episodes, I'll take you behind the scenes to key moments in the tumultuous US-China relationship. Plus, I'll speak with insiders in both the US and China, along with analysis from renowned China historian Rana Mitter.
Oh yeah, he's having problems. Okay, he's moving out a little bit. He's falling back. 9-2 is falling back.
You get the gist.
So why don't we were going to, as we planned this out, we didn't think we'd start first with tensions in the South China Sea or in spying, but why don't you pick up, since we just listened to that soundbite, pick up from there. What were we hearing? Where have we come in the last 20 some odd years?
So this was about an American surveillance plane. If you can imagine, it's got propellers, 4 propellers, and 26 people on board, stashed with computers and all kinds of spy gear. And it's over international waters, just outside of China. And they're looking inside into China. Basically, who knows why? That's classified probably, but it seems pretty clear that they were trying to figure out, one of their missions was to figure out things about China's military. And as they're cruising over these waters, a Chinese fighter jet purposely comes up very close to try and intimidate it. And in this case, hit the the American spy plane, which was badly damaged, and which you could hear the American pilot grappling to try and keep control of the plane and to stop the plane from sinking into the ocean. He managed to do an amazing job, and they landed with all 26 crewmen safe, men and women, on Hainan Island, which is a part of mainland China. Now, this is unheard of, that American crew should land unwelcome onto Chinese territory. I mean, the short story is that through great diplomacy, those 26 people were released some 3 weeks later and came back to the United States. And one of the reasons that I think we wanted to highlight this, aside from the fact that it's quite dramatic tape, is that moving to today, in 2025, if there was that kind of incident again, it would not end so happily. Why? Because the Americans would be very reluctant. They would not land on Chinese soil because they would not, they know that they would not be released. It would be a major, major, terrible incident. So if something like that happened today, it's highly likely that the Americans would ditch into the ocean, and it's highly likely that they would all sink and be killed. And then what would happen? There would be a race between the Americans and the Chinese to get to the crash site. And who would win that? Probably the Chinese, because they have more boats and faster boats than the United States in that part of the world. And anyway, they have a bigger navy than the United States now, which is quite amazing. China has a bigger navy than the American Navy. So that's something to think about, what would happen today rather than the happy ending back in 2001.
And the idea with the podcast is to figure out how to tell that story in a way that would be engaging for people who don't necessarily know anything about this or know, anything about the history or what's happening between the two nations currently. And starting with that piece of tape, that dramatic documentary, film piece of tape, but it was actually a frontline clip. We tried to weave that in with Jane's narration to set up the tension and to set up the subject matter that Jane and her guest interview could get into in more depth.
So I'll ask and continue off of there. Your first episode when you're launching a project is so important. So what decisions went into that first episode and laying out what people are going to hear?
Yeah, well, I'll first say that Jane originally wanted to make like a full-on documentary. She wanted it to be like a full half-hour, scored, sound designed, in-depth reporting for the whole thing, and we did not have the budget for that. So there was sort of a logistical decision that we had to make with okay, how can we make the most of this amazing piece of tape that we have, but also do it within our budget? So, we decided that we would create this scene that you just heard a little bit of at the top, right? And we would spend the first few minutes of the episode just kind of playing the tape and letting her basically just briefly narrate what's happening. And then we had to find a guest, right? So
we found the former head of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, Admiral Scott Swift, who I had met when I was a reporter in China, when relations were somewhat better than they are now. Occasionally, American Navy ships visited Shanghai, and he brought one of his ships into Shanghai, and I had met him in 2016. And then by the time I got to him when we were recording last year, he had retired, and so he was freer to talk.
Getting retired people is so helpful in shows like this because they're not beholden to anyone. They can share, they can spill all the dirt at that point because they don't care anymore. So we tried. Well, that actually is a great segue to what we do in the third segment. So we have an interview with him, and then in the third segment, we bring Jane's colleague, Rana Mitter, to provide some analysis and to say what the guests won't or can't say in the interview, and that's how the episode ends. And we try to do it very tight. We try to keep it somewhere in the 30 to 45 minute range so that you get, a broad understanding of the topic in a pretty tight package. So that's essentially how we put the first episode together, and then we try to duplicate that on lots of different topics for the episodes that follow.
Rana Mitter is a professor of modern Chinese history at Harvard. He comes in the podcast in almost every episode as a kind of a sounding board for a lot. Jane does the interviewing, tells the story, and then you transition to, Professor, what do you think? Where did that concept come from? Because that's unusual in a podcast. So many podcasts are voices, 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 and then they go away. Why did you want to add that element? It's really a high value element. He's very smart. He's very articulate. Talk a little bit about how you came up with that.
Yeah, well, Jane originally wanted him as a co-host. And, I don't know if you listen to like chat shows, where two people are talking. You need them both in the room, totally engaged with a very casual back and forth every single time. And Rana was just not available to do that. He is a very busy person. He teaches his own classes. He lives in the UK half the time. It was just not feasible, like logistically feasible. Also, Jane and Rana have a very different style. They're just, they just couldn't be more different in their presentation. And yes, Jane has this sort of, more narrative way of speaking, and Rana speaks in sound clips. He's very BBC. You ask it, he gives these pithy responses, and he's wonderful.
Like a professor.
He's like a professor, yes, and he gives these little mini lectures. And Jane's more of a journalist. She's looking for information. She's following her curiosity, and so trying to put those two together in like a co-host way just wasn't going to work. But they have a wonderful rapport. So logistically, I had to figure out what to do with him, where to put him, because he does matter and he's so very smart, and he does have knowledge that we wanted the listeners to have. So we sort of floated this idea of like, well, Jane, what if you interview him also, right? What if Jane is in the host seat by herself? You hear her name at the top, you hear her voice at the top, and then she does the interview. And then what if she also interviews Rana at the end to get his take, to get his analysis? And so we tried that in the first episode, and it worked. We only needed Rana for like 15 minutes. He because he can give such quick answers, we could, he'd be like, I've got 15 minutes, I got to run to class, or I have to run to a meeting. So we would get him in the studio. Jane would write her questions in advance. He would give these wonderfully pithy answers. They would have a laugh because they have this wonderful relationship, and then he'd leave, and we had what we needed for the end of the episode.
He'd run away.
He runs. Yeah. So it ended up working surprisingly well. It was an idea just to keep his voice in there that I had to try out, but it ended up working surprisingly well, and it adds to the it really helps us in the podcast because there are certain things that either the guest, like I said, won't say, or that we forgot, or if the news is moving very fast, we can and the interviews are often booked way in advance of the launch of the episode, we can get Rana very close to the end of the production process and ask him questions that are a little bit more on the news, and very quickly turn his part around so that it feels fresh. So it's doing a lot of work for a very short segment.
Before we get into the substance of China and the United States and the podcast topics, most of these students are print online students, some broadcast. Well, Jane, you spent your career in print, essentially, and online. Well, what is the difference in this medium? in how you structure your stories?
Well, the thing I love about podcasting is that it's a team effort led by Mia. We have, she can expound on this, but we have 5 people, and it's all 5 people, everybody contributes different aspects, but everybody's very creative, everybody loves doing the podcast, and it's like magic. And Len was my editor quite a long time ago, and I have
Not that long ago.
I have no aspersions to say about newspaper editors, but there's something magical about working with a team rather than responding to one particular editor. That's basically what I like about it. And of course, I like to reach a younger audience, an audience that doesn't necessarily listen to NPR or the New York or read the New York Times all the time. We're really trying to reach out to different kinds of audiences, people who are curious about China, don't know that much, and we hope that we present a palatable, interesting, sparky way to get familiar with the subject.
One thing I'll just add to that is that when you're reporting for print, you are going for information. When you do interviews for a print piece, you're going for information because you as the writer can fill in all the gaps, right? You can fill in the story with your own words. You can just get the facts that you need, and if you get a great soundbite, you can quote them, fine. But you have a lot of control as a print writer. In podcasting, you're going for story. Right? You need your guests to share, to create movies in people's minds. You need them to really expound on experiences and go for emotion. And that's what you can get from a podcast interview that you can't really get in the same way from print. And when Jane came in, say more.
I mean, I think when you're a reporter and you're trying to write a graphic story, you really try to get people's emotions. You really try to get the best out of the interviews.
But you're writing them yourself.
Yeah, but you still try and get emotion. You still try and get people's feelings in there.
Yeah. Well, the reason I mentioned it is because I feel like you've gotten better at when you do interviews over the course of these many episodes that we've done. You've changed your style a little bit.
I wasn't aware.
Yeah.
Good. If
You're following more of a narrative in the course of the conversation, and it feels like more of a conversation and less of an interview. I guess that's what I'll say. Right? It's a slightly different style.
Yeah. True.
And that's kind of leading me to the next question. It's so important in podcasting, as you mentioned in there, you need to have someone who can be compelling with you. And so, did you have any guests that you chose not to go for because you didn't know if they could be as compelling, or people you had to cut? Or, again, also to that extent, how much does that rely on the host to get more out of them, or the guest?
I mean, some hosts are probably really good at this, but if the person I'm interviewing isn't going to come to the party, isn't going to really share what I think that they have, I'm not very good at bringing them to do that. So we had an example recently when we interviewed one person on TikTok, which is an ever-moving subject, of course, about TikTok and will the United States, will American companies buy it, will it not, that was the basis of the interview, and the person we chose was frankly too old, too out of touch, and not good enough. So Mia called me up and said, I think we have to ditch this person. I said, yes, please. And we found a really terrific person in Louise Matakis who covers TikTok for Wired. And it is actually the episode that just dropped on Tuesday. So please listen in, it's our latest episode. And I think Louise is really talented, and she knows a lot about TikTok, and she can really tell the story.
And she uses the app. I mean, the problem with the original guest that we had is he didn't ever use it. Like he was analyzing it from the outside in this very academic way, and he had a lot of information, but there was no life to it, and Louise is a I mean, she's younger, she's female, and she uses the app and also reports on it. So it just made for a much more interesting conversation. And my job as the editor is to step back and play the role of the listener.
Although to be fair, I thought I chose the first guest because I thought he does know a lot.
Very knowledgeable.
No,
yeah.
But he knows a lot about a specific thing, which is how the big tech companies, Meta and all the rest of them, were lobbying Washington to keep TikTok out of the United States. That's basically what it's about. It's the so-called national security threat is secondary. There is a slight threat, but it's not anything that the United States couldn't overcome if they wanted to. And this guy knew about the huge lobbying efforts by Meta and so forth, but he didn't come across, and it was boring, and so we just ditched it.
That's what matters in the podcast version. If you're bored, you're not going to get any of the information. You're just going to tune out, and it's an opt-in medium. So if you're like, this guy's boring, then the information doesn't matter at all. And so Louise is maybe not our guest is maybe not quite as informed as the prior guest, but she presents the information in a way that is much more compelling.
She's actually better informed too.
Oh. Then we win. We win on both sides.
So TikTok did drop Tuesday.
Yes.
This week. You did redo it, partly with a guest, but events are moving quickly in the United States about TikTok since the Trump administration came into office. What do you want your listeners to come away with on the TikTok story, since it's going to keep moving and moving and moving? And you told us what you think the story is, the TikTok issue is about, but could you elaborate a little more on the TikTok, how TikTok became? Were you surprised it became such a national kind of political controversy?
Oh, no, of course not. If TikTok's appealing to 170 million listeners and Congress wants to shut it down, they've got a constituency of 170 million people they've got to deal with. So I'm not surprised that it's such a huge issue. I mean, I just wanted people to understand what TikTok is, that it's a Chinese company run by a company called ByteDance, how it started, who its owner is, why the algorithm is so compelling, how come American app makers haven't been able to come up with a similar algorithm. I mean, I say in one of my questions to Louise, making an algorithm for an app isn't exactly nuclear weapons. How come American companies haven't been able to come up with this? Those are the.
What's the answer?
No good reason.
And yet there's been one kind of technology like that leapfrogs over another, and yet doesn't seem to be any competition now for that 170 million, right? Given all the choices that we have for listening, reading, online, all of that. The Chinese are not apt to sit back and say, well, this is our product and we'll just refine it around the edges. They're apt to do their own innovation, correct?
Maybe you can answer that.
I don't know. Can you repeat the question?
What's the what?
I didn't quite.
Well, my question is, okay, the American social media has not tried to compete with TikTok. The American political view you tend to discount is that it could be a source of misinformation and maybe even.
I don't disagree that it can be a source of misinformation, but there are ways to counter that. I'm just saying that and I don't want to get into the whole politics of TikTok, I'm just saying that the big American corporations have fought tooth and nail and successfully in Washington to keep TikTok out. That's my personal view.
And Trump put it back.
Yeah, Trump wrote back because one of his friends, Jeff Yass, is one of the investors in TikTok.
Are you a TikTok? Or do you have a TikTok follow-up?
I was at the University of Florida and it was banned on campus, so no. Before it was banned on campus at the University of Florida, so we could not have it.
I mean, people forget that a lot of people make their living off TikTok.
No, and you might know some TikTok influencers on campus here, and people who've done that. I would ask you all, just by a show of hands, how many here have TikTok or have had TikTok?
Oh, every single one.
Yeah.
Sure.
So China should be really interesting to you, but I'm curious, do you think about China other than when it's like TikTok? Because a lot of what goes on in China impacts some of these things that you don't realize, right? And that's the beauty of this particular podcast, is to bring that to attention. And so I think Len has a similar question, but what do you want people to get out of this podcast? How do you want people to be changed by this? How do you want people to grow from learning this podcast?
You're talking about the podcast as a whole, or
as a whole? Yeah, as a whole.
Well, I think, as I said earlier, I'd like people who don't know a lot about China, but maybe know about China through TikTok, to know that this is a country of 1.4 billion people, that it's a peer competitor with the United States. That means it's a military competitor with the United States. That its economy influences the world economy, that it is the world's biggest manufacturer. And what does that mean? They make more EVs than any other country, that they're exporting those EVs to everywhere but the United States. And that you can't really just shove China back into your back pocket, that it's a country to be reckoned with. But it's not a country to be afraid of, that the United States is a big, strong, democratic country, more than capable of dealing with a rising China. And I would like people to come away from this podcast finding that China is interesting, that maybe it's a threat, but the United States is strong enough and smart enough to outcompete it.
Yeah, and I'll add, if you're a journalism school student, you're reading the headlines, you're seeing China in the news every single day, right? And from my perspective, I don't know the first thing about China. I've never been there. I've never really focused on it. And yet I'm seeing this sort of increasing focus on it in the news. And to me, the point of the podcast is to give people sort of a contextual view of what is going on from somebody who knows and has been covering this nation for a long time, and do it in a way that feels accessible. To me, that's sort of the gist of what we're doing here.
Absolute best summary.
Okay, so enough talk. Let's play some more. Let's play. We've got several bits of sound. Let's play Apple.
All right.
Speaking of technology.
So this was our second episode of last season, and the reason I wanted to play this clip is because one of the things that is wonderful about Jane is that she is literally in the room for a lot of the stories that we tell on the show, and this is an example of that.
Biplane is flying over the South.
The doors are about to open. We hear the cheering. We're about a minute away.
It's late September 2023. At the Apple store on Fifth Avenue in Manhattan, people are lined up around the block, waiting to be the first to buy the latest iPhone 15.
And now, here's Tim Cook. He's right behind the doors. We might be able to see him right now. Doors about to open. Let's take
With
a
all
minute.
the fanfare, you'd think it was a movie premiere.
Looks like a lot of people are taking selfies with Tim Cook. He's definitely the celebrity draw there.
He is. This is the routine we've been going through for 16 years now, since the first iPhone launched, and people are still lining up, still want to take selfies. I'm reminded
I actually met this celebrity once in 2015 in the elegant dining room on the top floor of the State Department. I was reporting on a lunch for the leader of China, Xi Jinping. I was standing off to the side, minding my business, my MacBook Air open in my hand, when the man himself, Tim Cook, wanders up. He's slim, trimmed gray hair, nice laptop, he says, a big smile on his face, playing that ever-familiar role, charming diplomat.
So that's the lead in, that's the lead into this episode. And I feel like it just adds legitimacy. Like, why are, one of the things you have to do in a podcast is you have to explain why this host is the host. Like, why are they important, like, to this particular story? And I feel like, in this playful way of Jane saying, like, I'd met the guy, like, I was there in the room when it happened, it just sort of like makes you want to lean in and listen to her a little bit more.
So let's talk about Apple's complicated relationship with China. The ups, the downs, the backups, the down again. Summarize that, if you will. It's in the podcast, but where's this going?
So I want to ask the room, where do you think your iPhones are made? Well, put it this way, how many people in the room know that their iPhones are made in China? Oh, you do know. Okay, all right, good enough. So the complicated relationship is this. As you all know, it's made in China and then imported into the United States. And Donald Trump says he's very keen on putting tariffs on everything that comes in from the United States. So for a bunch of reasons, including that Apple is trying to diversify and trying to make its iPhones in Vietnam and in India, but it's finding it extremely difficult because, I'm sure, I don't know this for a fact, but I'm sure the Chinese are putting a lot of incentives in front of Apple to keep the majority of the production in China. And the problem with Vietnam is that they've got very good skilled workers, but they don't have the scale. They've got a population of about 60 million people, and so they don't have enough people to make the iPhones. And in India, they've got the population, but they don't have the skills. They don't have the precise trained people on the assembly lines. So I think Apple's finding it quite difficult to transition out of China. Not that I think that they want to be completely out of China, but they would like to have a lot more of their production elsewhere. And by the way, there's a very good book about to come out in May by a reporter for the Financial Times, which is really my favorite newspaper next to the New York Times. It's British-based, but it's really an international newspaper. They have great reporters. And one of their reporters, Patrick McKee, has just finished his book on Apple in China and all the problems that I just outlined, and I think it'll be a very good read.
But how did it ever go back? One of your podcast episodes talks about how China got into trouble, or Apple got into trouble in China, but the marriage was a little bit on the rocks. And what was that episode all about?
Well, I suppose.
Just supply chain stuff?
Man, you've got a better memory than I don't remember particularly, but I mean, yeah, they have trouble from time to time because, you know, Chinese companies want to come in and do what Apple's doing, and the government is allocating more work to Chinese companies than the Taiwanese-based company that's organizing Apple's manufacturing in China.
In that episode, we interview a journalist from The Information who, you know, has been reporting on this for a very, very long time, and he shares a story of something that he uncovered over the course of his reporting to our audience. And it's interesting to me to kind of to have Jane ask him quite, you know, I love when Jane talks to journalists because it's a little bit of a like, wow, how'd you get that story? You know, it's like it's not a competition, it's sort of a friendly nod to the, you know, one veteran talking to another veteran. And so this journalist kind of shares a story of something that he uncovered that's really, you know, sort of shocked Jane, and they sort of get into that in the episode, which I think is fascinating. And then also get some of the backstory about some of the stuff Jane already shared about where the manufacturing could happen and why it's still happening in China and why it's complicated. And we do that in a few different episodes, talking to different journalists about what they've uncovered. There's one that we did not too long, the second episode of this season, about the role of journalists in China. And Jane speaks with a journalist who was kicked out of China in, what year was it?
2020. Well, in 2020, a whole bunch of American journalists were kicked out. Do you want me to talk about that?
Yeah, let's talk about it. We don't have that.
I do, I have that.
Do we have Richard Roth?
Hear it, yeah.
Let's go back, let's flash back to Tiananmen Square and the moment there with Richard Ross of CBS News. And then let's talk about what's happened to journalism coverage of foreign correspondents in China.
So this is, I have to skip one, so let's see if this.
Oh, there it is. Yeah, you skipped.
We're about a minute away.
Not that one.
In 2011,
Not that one.
Row Home Productions.
Now this is the beginning of it.
spring of 1989, Tiananmen Square. CBS correspondent Richard Roth landed in China to report on the enormous pro-democracy student protests. He was not alone.
It was a cast of hundreds, or close to 100 probably, for CBS at that time.
It's hard to believe now, but back then there were many American correspondents reporting from inside China. And Roth, along with his crew of producers, camera people, and fixers, wandered freely among the protesters camped out on the square.
In retrospect, it was something of a surprise to me because I had worked in very strictly controlled societies in countries where the regime has a very firm hand on any kind of interaction between journalists or foreigners in general and local people. And once you entered Tiananmen Square, there was none of that. But beyond that, people were absolutely desperate to show us as foreign reporters what they were doing and demonstrate to us the joy and the seriousness of their movement.
Western journalists were free to file live audio reports and send video out through Hong Kong, where they could be transmitted via satellite to New York a few hours later. Roth himself started reporting via cell phone, a rare thing in those days.
The 1989 cell phone that I remember was sort of shaped like a shoe. It weighed, I guess, about a pound, and it was like holding a small brick in your hand. And I said, well, I'll just stick one in my bag and see if it works.
This is a CBS News special report. From CBS News headquarters in New York, here is Bob Schieffer.
And we want to go immediately to Richard Roth in Tiananmen Square. The troops were moving toward him at last report. What's happening, Dick?
Bob, there are fires burning, blockades burning at two corners of the square. Soldiers now moving into the square again from the south. This time, they're moving exactly toward us. I'm going to move out of the way a bit.
The night of June 3rd, things heated to a boiling point. 200,000 soldiers had arrived in the center of the city, ordered to clear the square and crush the protest.
So I was moving around the square trying to assess what was going on, and from the right came a column of troops, armed troops with their rifles held in front of them, their bayonets pointed into the air. And they spotted us, and they turned and came to us. And I was on the phone at this time.
You hear that gunfire?
Fire, we do hear it.
Okay, we've got to get out of here. They're after Derek now. They're ripping away his camera.
They pulled Derek down. They pulled me down.
They're ripping away his camera, and they're coming for us. We're trying to move back and move away.
And I, of course, shouted the words that every correspondent in trouble knows, "I'll go, I'll go, I'll go."
I'll go, I'll go, I'll go.
Which apparently in New York sounded like, "Oh no, oh no, oh no."
I'll go, I'll go.
Hello, this is New York. Does anybody hear us?
So it was the sound of gunfire and then a dead phone line. That was the last New York heard from me.
So, do you want to speak a little bit about the value of that tape?
Yeah, you know, when you have tape like, Jane knew that this tape existed. I had never heard it before. When you know you have something like that in podcast, like in audio world, it's gold, right? You want to use something like that. It's so dramatic. But what I think makes this work even more than just the tape itself is Richard Roth today being interviewed by Jane, kind of listening back and narrating what he was thinking when that was happening. It really just makes it so, like, it's better. I mean, it's a little hard in this room, but like when you're listening to that in headphones, you are just like in it. And it's so, I don't know, it gives you the chills. You know, I know when I heard this tape for the first time, it gives you the chills. And it's all being set up. The whole thing is setting you up to understand that that could never happen today. And that's what the whole episode is really about. So these first, what I play, like 3 or 4 minutes, you know, is just to basically give you this visceral sense of what it's like to be on the ground reporting, and this sense of loss, you know, that there's no way that that could happen, you know, and this terrible event, of course, but no way that the coverage of that kind of event could happen today. And then it pivots to Ling Ling Wei, this reporter who's been there for many years, who was kicked out in 2020. So it just, you know, it's the power of the audio to hook you and get you to pay attention to the rest, right?
Yes, I wanted to make the point that this is really the most historic event, I think, in China since 1972 when Richard Nixon went, and there were a lot of journalists there to cover it, tons and tons and tons. But today, it's hard to believe that there are only about 20 Western journalists working for American media in China today. I mean, this is shocking.
In all of China, right?
In all of China, covering 1.4 billion people. Why is this? Basically, it's because in 2018, the Trump administration decided that it would expel about 60 Chinese journalists from the United States. Not all of them, I'm not sure the percentage, but it was probably about, I don't know, a third of the Chinese journalists. On on the grounds that some of them were spies. Now, I have no doubt that some of them were writing little notes back to the Ministry of Security Services saying this and this about the United States, but I doubt very much that they were doing really serious spying. And anyway, my attitude is if you have people doing light spying like that, better to have them in front of you so you can see what they're interested in rather than sending them back home. And the Trump people did this knowing full well that there would be retaliation, and of course there was, and half the American journalists in China were expelled in early 2020, including Ling Wei, who I interview as a main interview in this episode. So to give you a sense, when I was bureau chief in the New York Times, when I left in 2019, we had 10 journalists in China, 8 in Beijing and 2 in Shanghai. Today, the New York Times has 2, and if one of them leaves, there's a high probability that there would be no visa for a new one. I mean, this is all based on visas. You can only become a journalist inside China if you get an official visa from the Chinese government. And the Chinese government is furious at the expulsions by the Trump administration. Number one is holding back very severely on American journalists in China. So the New York Times now has 2, the Wall Street Journal has 3, down from 15, and the Washington Post has a big fat 0. And I think this is a very serious situation because there's lots of coverage about China in the American news media right now, but most of it comes from Washington, and a lot of it comes from reporters out in Asia who rely on statistics and figures to make the point. And some of these are really great stories, but I don't think you can really understand China unless you have journalists on the ground who can interview real people. Now, that's really hard to do in China these days because the Chinese don't want you to do that as journalists. So there's surveillance and there's all kinds of problems of getting to talk to real Chinese people who don't want to talk to foreign reporters anyway. But it's better to have people on the ground than not to have people on the ground.
The stakes couldn't be higher, you know, and I think being able to illustrate that in this episode is really important. And by the way, Richard Roth doesn't like to share this story anymore, but he picked up the phone for Jane. That's one of Jane's superpowers, is everyone will take her call because she has such a long-standing trust with the community.
But the thing is that the team made the episode sound so great.
He was happy.
That crusty old Richard Roth, now living in retirement in London, wrote me a note and said, "Oh, I'm so happy I did this. I didn't want to do it, but I'm so happy I did it. Congrats to the team." So that was fantastic.
Yeah.
Jane, talk a little bit. You mentioned surveillance and what it's like to report on the ground. I visited China as an editor, you know, a handful of times, and I was always cognizant of the fact that my movements were tracked, my visas were limited. Any question I'd ask somebody, even a high school student, they knew that they were absolutely paralyzed about how they would talk to you. Explain the nitty-gritty a little bit of
So there are ways
reporting.
of getting around this. So I'll give you an example. So in 2017 or so, the US was very interested in what North Korea was up to. In particular, we've always been interested in what North Korea is up to, but this was a particularly hot moment. And Washington was very upset because it looked as though the Chinese were keeping the North Korean regime afloat, you know, that they were allowing the North Koreans to earn enough money to make more nuclear weapons. So this is a fairly simple kind of story, but we went up, and when I say we, I should also say I don't speak Chinese, so I rely, and many of our other reporters rely, very heavily on news assistants. These are young Chinese journalists, would-be journalists, people like you, Chinese, work in our Beijing and Shanghai bureaus as interpreters of what we call fixers who arrange interviews and, in my case, travel together. So I won't call his real name, but let's say, let's call him by an English name. William and I flew from Beijing to Dandong. Dandong is the border town between China and North Korea. We wanted to find out, we knew that the Chinese textile manufacturers were using North Korea as a place to make cheaper goods. They could make pants and sweaters and stuff in Pyongyang, at factories in Pyongyang, cheaper than they even could in Dandong or in China. So we went up to Dandong, determined to find, we had some leads, determined to find out how they were making, how Chinese manufacturers were making stuff in North Korea. And as soon as we landed at the airport, we were followed by, I don't know why for this time, but we were followed by five or six MSS, Ministry of State Security cars. There were mostly young people in the cars. I don't quite know why, but once we got to the airport, they knew we were going to be on that plane. They scanned all the passenger lists. So we went from place to place in Dandong and, you know, got followed everywhere. And we had a date with a manager of a Chinese factory in Dandong who was also doing business with Pyongyang. We were able to lose these MSS young agents in a shopping mall, and William was able to peel off and go into a pizza parlor and meet the factory manager, and she told her story, and her story was that every month she goes from Dandong to Pyongyang with $100,000 American dollars in her knapsack to pay the workers in Pyongyang for the clothes that they were making. So we had our story. So we were very happy with that, and we were able to do it under the surveillance of MSS.
Did they ever catch up with you?
No. I mean, that's a kind of, you know, but they wouldn't care too much about that. But if you go to places where you shouldn't be, then it's much more serious.
But would you ever leave your laptop in a hotel room and
God,
go?
no, of course not. You take your laptop, phone everywhere. In fact, State Department people are told when they check into a hotel in Beijing or city in China that they must keep their cell phone and their laptops at all time with them inside the room. So when you take a shower, you take the cell phone to the shower, etc. Not under the water, of course.
I once left a laptop in my room in Beijing. I came back with the family. We'd gone out to see the Great Wall, came back, and the butler of the hotel floor comes to me and he says, Mr. Apkar, we apologize for the broken lock on your door. And I said, the lock is broken? Yes, the lock is malfunctioning. And I thought, aha, this really is true. And I had taken the laptop and buried it in a drawer of a piece of furniture. And I'd actually forgotten about it until my son said to me, Dad, don't you remember the guy apologizing for breaking the lock? And I said, oh yeah. What they got out of a laptop, but I would assume that the same MO happened for you as it did a decade earlier for me. We never had a conversation in the office about anything but what we were working on. We always went for a walk. It was like being part of the mafia. You never talked in a room. True?
No. Of course we talked in the office.
About stories, about what you're working on?
Of course. And you know, our news assistants were invited by the security services to have tea every couple of months, in which, you know, the security services would ask our news assistants what they were working on and what was going on in the office. And I would say to our news assistants, I asked them, one, tell me when you got a date with these people, because I don't want anything to happen. You know, I don't want them to sort of suddenly decide to book you into a hotel. And number two, tell them the truth, because you're not doing anything wrong.
Access-wise, that's important, right? And so for you, if you couldn't tell the story from your perspective, how did you bring in other elements? So for instance, the CBS thing, you didn't know that was available. You didn't know that, but Jane did, right? And so were there other elements that you needed to get that you didn't have access to? Because I know in gathering audio a lot of times, there's stuff out there, but it's hard to get. You don't have the resources for it. You might not have the use for it. Were there other things that were hard to get or very unique to get because of Jane's relationship or what you were able to track down?
I'm trying to think. I mean, you know, I've worked in with a lot of different like archival and just in the course of my career, and there's always something, right? You can always make use of something, and if you don't have it, you can use things like sound design or sound effects to try to like bring things to life. So I can't think of a specific thing. I feel like you always have something.
Well, we're going through this right at the moment. We're going to do our final episode in this season is going to be about the relationship between Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin. They have this really unholy closeness. I can't quite figure out why or how. And I've got to go through YouTube and find some. They've met a lot of times in rather unusual places. In Bali, they've met in the Winter Olympics in China a few years ago. So we're going to try and find some audio, but I'm not sure it'll be as exciting as the spy plane audio.
Well, you just reminded me of one. Also in our first season, we did an episode about Xi Jinping and Biden. And there was a little piece of audio, or video actually, of the two of them playing basketball that was just on YouTube. And our producer, Nina Porzuki, found it. And we were able to drop that just in the very beginning, just to illustrate the relationship a little bit. Of course, there's no tape of their meeting each other. You know, it doesn't. You know, I actually watched a couple of videos where you see Xi Jinping standing up and making toasts, and it's so performative. It doesn't have any.
No juice.
No juice, right. But we were able to take this little clip of them playing basketball, and Jay narrates it and describes what's going on in the video, and that's kind of the way in for that.
Do you want to play that? You've got it.
I do have that one. I have to go backwards. Let's see.
That's true.
Hopefully it'll work.
Let's see if we can do that.
See if I can back up. Maybe.
Ping for the first time in China. They were both vice presidents. And the idea was that they would just get to know each other. They went for walks, had meals. They played basketball together. There's a video of this. Xi stands grinning on the sidelines while Biden makes a basket to big applause. According to Biden, it was the start of him and Xi Jinping really connecting. But how well can anyone really know the elusive Xi Jinping? I'm Jane.
Wow, making a lot out of a little.
Right. I mean, it works to set things up, and then you meet the guest of this particular episode, Min-Chin Pei, who has a wonderful way of being like, yeah, nobody knows anything about Xi Jinping. Like, everybody's wrong about him. You know, he's very matter of fact and very free with his. He's able to share a lot, absolutely. Right, as opposed to some other sources that you've had.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Min-Chin Pei grew up in China during the Cultural Revolution, came from a very poor family in Shanghai, came to the United States just before the 1989 Tiananmen massacre, and made his way to Harvard. And he told me that he hung out in the corridor outside the office of John Fairbanks, who's kind of the dean of Chinese studies in the United States in the 1980s and 90s, and he made such a pest of himself that Fairbanks agreed to talk to him, and then Fairbanks, I guess, was so impressed that Min-Chin was able to study at Harvard.
He's a great guest. Like, we've brought him back for season 2. So our first episode of this current season is about Xi and Trump. And we brought Min-Chin back to talk about that because he and Jane have this great rapport, and also he just knows everything. You know, he just understands these relationships with these leaders so well.
If you find yourself making 8 episodes in a series, in a podcast series, Mia's always telling me that it's good to bring back guests who go down well with the audience. So that's a little tip.
Yeah, they become familiar. You know, they're like recurring characters. I think work well in something like this if you're trying to get to know a whole universe, right? Familiarity helps. Makes you feel part of it too. Like, oh, I remember him from last season. Right?
How many here plan to make podcasts? Oh, great! Wow, this is excellent.
My whole goal is to convert people from whatever it is that you're doing now into podcasting. That's my grand plan.
Does anybody want, can I just ask, does anybody want to ask some questions?
We have a roving mic, one of the ambassadors, who has questions.
Mic's up here.
Oh, it's up here.
We don't need a mic. They can.
It roamed away.
No questions, and you want to be journalists. Oh, disappointed. Okay.
While we're on
Oh, here's one. Here's one.
Oh, here one. Okay, Eli. No, use the mic. It's being recorded. The Chinese are listening.
Do we have to twist the bottom?
Not sure.
I don't know. Just tap it.
Tap the top.
On the top. Yep.
Okay, so.
Talk loud.
We can hear you.
Yeah.
When you're in a place like China where it's so difficult, and you talked about that, where you had to run away from the MSS.
MSS, yeah.
What is like your day-to-day life living there? Is it in fear? Are you always constantly checking yourself? And like when you say it's hard to ask questions, are people really that unwilling to answer?
Well, I have to say I left, it's a good question. I mean, I left in 2019, and in the years that I was there from 2012 to 2019, no, did not live in fear. You led a normal life. You took precautions, of course, but there was no fear, and people were reasonably, usually reasonably willing to talk. But things have gotten much worse in the last 4 or 5 years, and I've heard that it's now quite difficult for Western reporters to talk to ordinary Chinese. I wouldn't say that's a blanket statement, but I think it's become much more difficult because the competition, Xi Jinping has made the competition with the United States so much more stark. And so I think, I don't think we couldn't do, for example, that trip to Dandong on the North Korean border again. I don't think that would be possible. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't have reporters in China, because as I said, there's always a way to get around it, and there are ways to talk to people, and there are ways to do stories. For example, the New York Times reporter Keith Bradshaw, who concentrates on the economy, is able to go to factories all over the place, and he's written really very interesting stories about how China is far ahead on battery manufacturing because they've put their mind to it, and they've got the best battery manufacturing processing in the world. So I think if you choose your shots, you can.
How is he able to do that, though? Is there something unique about him or his access?
Well, first of all, the Chinese are very happy to have reporting about how they are the manufacturing king of the world.
So they're confident that he's going to tell a positive.
I don't want to demean Keith in any way of always writing a positive story, but it is a positive story from the Chinese point of view. And he's able to arrange visits with, and he's a known quantity. He's been covering trade, and he covered Detroit for many years, as Len knows. He really knows manufacturing very well. So I think that makes a difference, that the Chinese know that he will be fair. And he makes appointments with factories, and they allow him to go, and he goes by high-speed train, and he goes all over the country.
Is he coming in and out of the country, though? Or is he?
No, he stays most of the time in the country.
In country? More questions? We have a working mic. Good.
We hope.
Okay, this might be a little similar because you've mentioned just the difficulty and that it is important that we have people reporting in China. But my question is, what made you realize that you're the person to do that? Like, what motivated you personally to take on the risk and take on the difficult task? Because I'm sure you could have gone somewhere else and had an easier time doing your job. So what motivated you to be like, this is what I'm going to dedicate my life to?
Well, I wouldn't say I dedicated my life to China, but anyway, I'll explain it this way.
You've been in other places that have similar challenges.
But I did go as a university student. I grew up in Australia, and so I was able to go to China before Americans were able to go. So I went with a student group during the Cultural Revolution when I was a teenager. 50 of us went We were all apolitical. Some of us were very conservative. Some of us were less conservative. Some had no politics. I basically had no politics at the time. But it was, the country was in chaos. But you could see that it was huge, and everybody was determined, and everybody was very bright, even though Mao Zedong had tried to sort of set everything upside down. You could see that it was going to be a force. So it always intrigued me. And then I became a correspondent in Africa, and then when I went to Indonesia in the early 2000s, Indonesia is a really important country, the most populous Muslim country in the world. It sits just in Southeast Asia below China. And I wrote the first series of articles about the influence of growing influence of China in Asia. I think you remember that, Len. And so that led me to keep thinking about it. And then I went to Pakistan, and I could see the influence of China there. And then one day, the executive editor at the time, Jill Abramson, called up and said, why don't you go to China? You can cover China and the world, China and its relations with the world, which was basically my beat. And so I said, okay, you're on, I'm going. So off I went.
Opportunity.
How would you compare the China story with the other regions of the world you worked?
Oh my God, the China story is so much more important. I mean, I was in Indonesia for 5 years. How many of you have ever know about Indonesia or have read a story? Not many. So the China story is critical, and I think it's critical that Americans know as much as they possibly can about it.
Did you have a question?
Whoa. How do you present yourself as a journalist to different people, seeking a story from them? Because we talk about audio and podcasting and like wanting to develop the story. Like, how do you present yourself to different people who maybe know who you are or don't know who you are, and seeking information or like withholding what you know? Like, how do you go into like questioning?
Can you give me an example? I'm not.
Like withholding something maybe you know about them and you want to get a certain story or them to elaborate on something. Like, do you present the facts and what you know, or do you how do you present yourself when you talk to people?
That's a good question. I mean, the booking, like you do all the booking, right? So when you go to get somebody, when you want to talk to them for the episode, how do you make your ask?
Oh, I see. I'm just very general. I don't ask for any particulars. It's not on a podcast. You're not looking for breaking news, so it's a little different to being a journalist trying to push the envelope on some particular story.
But you do a lot of, you'll meet people before you get them on the podcast. You're like, somebody's coming through Harvard, I'm just gonna meet them and we're just gonna talk, right? It's like, it's really fascinating just from the outside to watch Jane go about what she does. Maybe you just don't see yourself doing it, but it's not like I'm just gonna call you up and interview you for the podcast. It's like, we have a relationship already, and now I'm gonna interview you for the podcast. And so people will kind of come through Harvard or come through wherever, and she'll have I don't know, I would call it a pre-interview, but I don't think that that's really I don't think that's how you think about it necessarily.
Podcast interviewing is a little different to newspapering interviewing. So with a newspaper, you're really looking, many times you're looking for news. I mean, so for example, when we went to the North Korean border, we really wanted to prove something. We wanted to prove that they really were making clothes in Pyongyang, and so that's a little bit more difficult. That's just a small, tiny example. But when you're on a podcast, you're really looking for somebody who's engaging and who will illuminate the subject and make it interesting for a general audience.
And they have to trust you in order to do that. And you can't, if you're just gonna grill somebody, that if you have a relationship with someone already, they trust you to have a good conversation with them and not go after them or or shock them. It's not that kind of show, right? So I feel like you do a lot of pre-work to make that happen. It feels very organic to me. I don't know, but I don't have an eye on a lot of your process.
Does that help?
Okay.
I think here.
Thank you. Hi. Okay. So I was gonna ask, because you were talking about the rise of China and them having a bigger navy than us and them being at the head of manufacturing. And recently there's been the conversation about China's development of AI and their companies kind of showing off on America, and I was wondering if that was a conversation y'all planned on talking about on the podcast or at all.
Yes.
Yes.
In
Okay,
fact,
perfect.
that is the episode we're working on right now.
Awesome.
And it's going to be episode 7 of 8. So I forget exactly when it's coming out, but a few weeks. That was another one, though, that we recorded the first interview before the DeepSeek news came out. And we chucked it because DeepSeek, I mean, it actually is not as big a game changer as I would have thought. And I think Jane knew that, but the conversation felt dated without even mentioning it. So another call to Jane, like, Jane, I think we need to redo this one. And she was like, okay, no problem. And we found another, another guest.
And a better guest.
A better guest, yeah, to put on that episode. So we are talking about it. It's a really interesting subject matter. So yeah, stay tuned.
So Jane, I know you're not that excited about the tariff story.
Which one?
The tariff story.
Oh.
But, Trump put 10% tariffs on most Chinese goods. China reacted fairly calmly. Apparently this morning he announced another 10% tariffs on top of those 10. So if he persists with them, how does China respond, and sort of what is the long-run implication for the U.S.-China competition around the world?
I'm a minority of one. I just am really reluctant to forecast where things are going to go with China. I would just say at the moment that Xi Jinping's being pretty smart and just waiting to see what Trump wants to do. He's not taking any major steps. He doesn't have to. I guess he's going to try and assess whether Trump's trying to kill the Chinese economy. But I think, I don't know what else to say. But I don't think it's going to go to any place good. Any place good. Or put it this way, Trump keeps talking about how he can have a beautiful relationship with Xi Jinping. But I think that that's just false bravado. I don't see how China will be restrained from being the dominant power in Asia. And, I think the United States just has to reckon with the fact that they've been the preeminent power in Asia for 70 years, and that this is not going to continue in the way that it has. And they have to devise a sensible policy that allows the United States to be in Asia, but perhaps not the preeminent power. But unfortunately, I don't think that kind of thinking is going on at the moment.
Do you want to talk, while we're talking about relations, both by leaders and by the kind of the political and strategic tensions between the leaders, the countries, including Putin? Do you want to sum up what you think in terms of Trump, Xi Jinping, and Putin, how this kind of three-way dance plays out?
Well, I'm just really rather sad to say that I don't even see it as a dance at the moment. It looks to me as though Trump wants to join Xi Jinping and Putin, and I can't believe it. I cannot believe it. Putin has invited Xi Jinping to go to Moscow to review the Russian troops on May the 9th, and there's some thought that maybe Trump will join them. This is just unbelievable. So.
Unbelievable, explain.
Well, you explain it, it's obvious.
I'm just an editor, you explain it.
Look, the United States has prided itself on being, as I said earlier, the strongest, most democratic country in the world. And now the leader of the United States is aligning with the two most repressive, powerful countries in the world, two repressive countries that have nuclear weapons like the United States. And how we can line up with these two countries as allies is beyond my, it's very hard to fathom.
That's what I wanted you to elaborate on.
The stakes are high. Yeah.
The stakes are very high, and I have to say it's hard sitting here in Baton Rouge to kind of wrap your mind around it.
But listen to this and you'll get your head around it.
The podcast helps a lot. Travel helps enormously. I didn't appreciate the story until I went many years ago and stayed for quite a while, particularly if you can live there and not be a tourist. A tourist gives you a very superficial view of any country, frankly, but certainly China. Asia? I should say this is a director of Asian Studies, Professor Alone.
If you want to know more about Asia or China, at LSU, we do have a minor in Asian Studies. I'm the Director of Asian Studies. My name is Asya Alam. I'm in the History Department. So please take courses, and that will give you historical depth to all these issues. I'm a historian of South Asia. My expertise is in India, and I was thinking that that is a country that has not been mentioned yet. So where do you see India in this story? They are supposed to be, US and India are now allies, but there have been certain developments in India that have brought strain or not. We don't exactly know, but where do you see India coming in?
That's a big question. Well, I think it's helpful to know that India has gotten closer to the United States in recent years, but in fact, India gets almost all of its military equipment from Russia. That's the first thing to understand. The second thing is that China and India are very, very wary about each other. There have been serious border clashes, and I'm just not quite sure where that's going to end up. I think the United States would like India to be on its side and tries to make some moves, but I think they're fairly unconvincing moves. So I think that's an open question. I think from the United States' point of view, if they can persuade India to be on its side, so to say, it would be really, really helpful. And I think I read something the other day where the United States is considering providing India with more weapons. So that's a step in the right direction.
We have time maybe for one more, if there is one. No? Well, I want to thank our guests, Jay Perlez, Mia Lobel, Ryan Vasquez. He's part of the Mansion family, but he's still a guest. And
thank you, everybody. You were a great
thank all
audience.
of you. I'm glad you came. I hope you got a lot out of it, and stay tuned to the podcast. Every Tuesday is a new episode. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for paying attention.